Penn State COMMversations is a podcast produced by the Donald P. Bellisario College of Communications. Episode topics range from the people, programs, and events that shape the Bellisario College to discussing key aspects of life in the professional world for young and upcoming communications alumni. Please enjoy this episode of Penn State COMMversations.
So how long was the book process? Like, when did it begin? And did you know it was beginning, or did you start, was the intent a book all along?
I knew it was beginning. I got lucky. A book agent actually reached out to me to write the book. I wish I could say I was brilliant and said, "Oh, we should write a book on the Big East." I had written the story for The Athletic about all the crazy coaches meetings in the Big East, and this book agent reached out to me on Twitter. He's like, "Hey, I think there should be a book done on the Big East. Are you interested?" And I was like, "There isn't one?" Like, what? So once he hit me up, I was all in. So I started working on it. We had to put together the formal proposal. That was back in, like, gosh, I don't even know, 2019, I guess, like that Christmas. Like, we started, and then go to New York and shop it around to publishers. And then, at the same, like, you're kind of like, well, I got to get moving. So, the problem was, of course, I started to do this thing and then COVID hit. So my intent to go up and down the coast and talk to all these people kind of digressed into a lot of Zoom calls and things like that. But I got lucky that I did see Lou Carnesecca before everything shut down, because I don't think you can do Louis on a Zoom. And then, I got everybody else either the phone or the Zoom. So it was about a year and change, I guess, altogether.
How much did the relationships through the years help make that work? I mean, it's one thing to do Zoom with people you don't know. It's another thing to do Zoom with the people you've dealt with for years, right?
Yeah, it was so much easier. I mean, I know Jim Boeheim, I know Jim Calhoun, I know John Thompson Jr., I knew Louis, I know, Jay Wright and PJ Carlesimo, and, all the major, Mike Tranghese, the big players that you need to do this book, right? I had existing relationships where not only could I be comfortable to do an interview, but I could also say, "Hey, I want to do this book. Are you guys in? Will you talk to me?" And they were all in, Rick Barnes, Gary Williams, Rick Pitino. So that had to happen. And then from there, you go out to some of the players, and some I knew and some I didn't. And, you kind of use, "Hey, I got your number from so-and-so," and dial it back as far back as you can go. So there's no way I could do this if I had tried to do this earlier in my career or without the relationships I had built over the course of my career.
Who was your biggest get, like, that you were surprised that talked, and who were you unable to get?
Well, the one I was unable to get, the Holy Grail, was Allen Iverson. I tried everything up to, like, John Thompson III sending out a bat signal. Like, we were like, I tried everything. I just couldn't get him. And I was bummed, just because, first of all, I find Allen to be fascinating. And obviously he was such a unique part of the Big East. So that was kind of a bummer. Big gets, I think the two that stand out, look, John Thompson Jr., I've known him, like I said, forever, but you can't write a book on the Big East without John. And I am very grateful that I spoke to him before he passed away. And, because he's just so interesting and he has such a unique perspective. So he was a big one. And then, like, people like a not bit player, but, Michael Graham, like, he had a really sort of tempestuous relationship with the league. He got through that punch in that game, and he ended up not finishing after Georgetown because he didn't have the grades. And there's a lot of water under that bridge, and I wasn't sure how he'd be willing to talk about it. He was very open. So I thought that was a really good, important interview, because he brought a lot of depth and perspective to the situation that he was in and to what Georgetown was.
Along with the basketball, or maybe more importantly than the basketball, the Big East at that time, and what you're writing about, was about people, characters, personality. Michael Graham's a great example. There's basketball fans who can picture him in his mind and know, but all those coaches were characters. How did that affect the book, and how did it affect the league, more importantly? How important was that in what the Big East was and became?
I think it was instrumental, because, look, the league took off in 1979 kind of out of nothing, out of Dave Gavitt's brain. Like, he saw this thing that nobody else did. And I always say, like, the product on the court was amazing. Like, none of this, like, if the games stink and the players stink, it doesn't matter, right? You can have all this great theater, and if the games are lousy and not terribly competitive, or the teams aren't very good, the theater is, nobody cares. But you had these great games and these great players and these blood baths on the court, that then off the court, you had these crazy people that are literally like chasing each other down back hallways and cursing at one another because they're convinced that one of them is going to, one up each other. Gary Williams tells a story about literally chasing Rolly Massimino at a game at Boston College because he was convinced Rolly was going to go have like a quiet chat with the officials and get them on his side. I mean, crazy stuff. So that was so much a part of the league. It was kind of like, what in the world's going to happen today if I tune in? And for the book purposes, like for this to be interesting, I didn't want it to just be a narrative like this happened. You need stories. You need to go behind the scenes of these monstrous events that we all know about and get people to tell stories. And God bless. I mean, this league has so many epic storytellers. I mean, you could listen to like, Bill Raftery, for God's sakes, tell 1,000 stories, right? So that made the book so much more entertaining. It wasn't just this dry run of games. It was like, okay, here's the game. Now here's what happened that you didn't know during the game.
And you took the story that felt like, and did kind of like a start to finish through the league's history, but kind of worked your way through those points.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, the way I work and the way I write, like I'm relatively linear. So I needed an organizational structure that I could wrap my head around. And I wanted it to be a chronological history, but I didn't want it to be boring, right? So I thought, all right, let's lay out the moments in this league from start to finish, like inception to crash and burn and reform, if you will. How do we get there? And let's see if I can string a narrative through those moments. So it's basically like, here are the moments that now we're going to go backwards and say, here are the stories behind those moments and the depth of like a particular team or a person, and then go forward again. So that for me as a writer worked. And I think it worked for the book because that's how people think of the league, is they think of certain games, the sweater game, the Michael Graham throws a punch, 6 overtime. They have those moments in their mind, right? So it actually relates to the reader as well.
What was your first Big East moment or first Big East moments? Do you remember games you covered or incidents that you were at that just were like, oh, shit, this is happening here right now?
Yeah. I mean, everyone asked me that. I remember as a kid growing up watching games, right? I can't remember like a specific game. I remember watching Big Monday games and being like, holy cow, my brother went to Seton Hall. So I was all into the Seton Hall bandwagon, in 1989. I remember watching that as a high school a college kid. My brother was so excited about it, but I'm excited kind of watching it too. But as a reporter, I mean, there were a lot, but I was at the 6 overtime game. That was ridiculous. I mean, I felt like afterwards, I remember the next morning waking up, like, I'm pretty sure I didn't get that story right. But then how in the world are you supposed to get that story right? So I was there. I was then, Kemba Walker breaks Gary McGee's ankles and does his run, the Jerry McNamara run. For those, I mean, there were so many moments. I hate to pick one, frankly.
It felt like, and maybe it was the age we were when it happened, right? Like this was the biggest thing in the world,
yep.
Right? This was bigger than anything else. And Big Monday.
Yep.
Could the Big East as it happen again? Is it happening and we're overlooking it? I mean, it just felt like this was the first that happened, and there's this mythology that comes with it. It was actually reality in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I don't know if it could, because the difference was then, right? Not every game was on television. Like that was such a big part of it. Like the TV package that ESPN offered, because ESPN needed content because they were brand new and the league needed a place to show their games, made them must watch TV because there wasn't that much else to choose from, right? Like that was the game of the week. Mike Hopkins, who was the Syracuse assistant, tells a story about growing up in California, Pacific time, and riding home on his bike extra fast to make sure he got home in time to watch Big Monday games. Now every game is on TV, which is great. It's great for the sport. But it's almost like there's so much inventory. Like, well, what's the must-watch game of the week? You'll have your pop-ups. We're going to have, national big games like UCLA is going to play Gonzaga, those kinds of things. But it's different. It's not the same. And frankly, I think it's also, we've lost sort of that regionalization and that be true to your school, be true to your conference thing a little bit. Kids play all over the country. It's not as big of a deal to high school kids to kind of represent their league as much as it is to represent their school. Back then, like they were all pretty Big East proud. I think there's a difference now. And it's not bad, it's just different.
Are they now, when you talk to them, what did they remember and about what happened then, and what are they still Big East proud to have been a part of it?
100%. Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. You talk to like Chris Mullen and Patrick Ewing and Roosevelt Bowie and Louis Orr and Michael Graham and Gene Smith and Charles Smith and all these great players who came through the Big East. And they, first of all, they remember every moment because it was like the glory days, but they are so proud and aware of what they were a part of. They totally get how lucky they were, how amazing those games were, how special that conference was. They hold it in such high regard. You know, certainly there's, you know, pockets within their own teams, but there is such a kinship, I think, between all of those players and all of those coaches still. I mean, they still bust on one another. They still joke about it. There's just such a really neat relationship. And I think that was fostered by Dave Gavitt. When Dave Gavitt formed the league, his message to his coaches was, you can kill each other behind closed doors. I don't care. You can come to our meetings and curse at one another and accuse each other of anything you want. But out in public, you have to put the league first. So if you get eliminated from the tournament, you've got to be Big East proud. And they were. They absolutely were, which I'm not sure coaches are like that anymore. I'm really not sure. Some are, not all of them.
No, that's true. That feels true. I mean, I remember it was Georgetown, Virginia was like a pay-per-view game when Sampson was at Virginia.
Right, exactly.
Like, it wasn't as part of the package, but that was a big thing. And you got this feeling that the Big East was rooting for that.
100%. They understood that if one succeeds, they all succeed, right? They understood that Georgetown playing Virginia in that situation was good for the Big East. They understood that if Seton Hall got better, it was good for the Big East. It wasn't a threat to you, it was better for the league, and that would only raise your game. And I think, you know, I think people still believe that, but it was so ingrained in them that they just rooted for one another. It was amazing.
So when you're going through the process of the book and then start writing, who's your audience and what's your responsibility? Like, you're hearing all this good stuff, like it's and they're invested and you're invested because it's good stuff. How do you to whittle through all that and make sure you're telling the story that is the right story or the story that happened?
It's really hard and a little overwhelming because there's so many stories that you think to yourself, I'm sure I forgot something, right? Like, I can't possibly get them all in. And I'm sure there's another person, like there was always going to be another person I could talk to. It was a endless limit of sources, but at some point you got to turn a book in. So my thought was, like, to make sure I got it right, like that all the details were right and the memories were intact, and to get the players that really the most important people for each story, but then find the bit players that added flavor. Like, I was really excited to get the guy who played the Dome Ranger at Syracuse. Like, he was like this mascot before they had the orange, they had the Dome Ranger. Like, his insight was kind of a fan perspective, and I thought that was kind of fun. But I felt like such a responsibility to reflect the league properly. I think that was the most important thing, to not just get the stories funny and right, but to reflect sort of the underbelly of the league, like what was going on, why it worked, why they supported one another, and get that right. And the audience is like, you know, look, this is a nostalgia book. So there's people of that generation, of our generation, who I know are going to want to read it. But I hope that, like, people that are younger who maybe don't remember it as well, or they remember it at sort of the tail end when, you know, it was kind of falling apart, go back and understand why people were so disappointed when it did fall apart, and why that, you know, that end with the 6 overtime game and Kemba's run, like why that still resonated. So, you know, I think the audience, I hope, is pretty broad.
Big East still exists, but it doesn't exist like that. Like, was 6 overtimes the end point, and did people know it at the time, or was there some other? I mean, I know there's been so many machinations with in and out, whatever else. But when did the Big East, as you know it for book purposes, end?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of ended it purposefully at the 6 overtime game. I did a little bit of a gloss over with Kemba's great run with UConn in 2011, because that was, you know, ridiculous. But that 6 overtime game to me represented everything that was the old Big East told in new form, right? It was just this classic, ridiculous, only in New York game, only between these schools that have such a history that could happen. That to me is why that was a good ending point. And you're right, it's not the same, and nobody tries to pretend that it is. I mean, it's just not. But I do think the cool thing is when the league kind of folded and reformed, it kind of went back to its roots. It's kind of like, all right, well, this is Dave Gavitt's vision, reborn again, basketball first, schools that align in, you know, in appearance as well as thought. support one another. Everyone, like, they are pretty collegial within the league. They really are. So it kind of was cool that they reformed in sort of their own image. But I remember being like really sad at the last Big East tournament, thinking like, I mean, the last one in its old form, thinking like, I need to take a pause. I can't cover this for a couple of years. Like, I meant that. Like, I was in my head, like, I know it's not going to be the same, and I'm not discrediting what's going to be, but I need to walk away from this tournament because it's been such a fun. I used to like going to that sometimes more than the NCAA tournament. So I was like, I need to walk away for a couple of years and give myself a little distance. And I'm sure fans felt the same way. Like, it's not the same. So let me breathe a little and come back and revisit it.
Yeah, I mean, because it was the Garden, there was just something special about
Yeah.
that, and people wanted to come there. And there's like the guy I got, one of the guys I know who still follows Pitt and covers them, and not covers them as a fan, knew his pizza joints, knew his week by where they were
Right.
going for dinner when they came to the Garden and in New York. So there was just that flavor of them owning that event and college basketball in the
100%. I mean, every team had a college bar that for all the fans that went. The coaches had their own bars, the refs had their own bars, the sports writers had their own bars. Everyone convened. I know fans sometimes just like trying to choose, do I go to New York for the week or do I go to the NCAA tournament first round? They often chose New York because the games were epic. They knew that they were going to be great games. No matter what your team situation was, it was going to be a great game. And and New York was just, it's New York, it's the Garden, right? Like it sounds like trite, but it is true. I mean, it really is the epicenter. There's a reason the Big Ten moved its tournament a week early once to play in New York. There's a reason the ACC has come to New York. I thought it was really smart. Maybe the smartest thing the new Big East did was to make sure that they got the Garden back, because that's theirs. And that is their footprint, and that is their image, and that is their legacy. But it's also just so important to kind of how they are perceived. And to keep that relationship alive was critical.
The book itself, in terms of the process, again, just to jump back, like you write, how does it go through editing? How does it, like, what is that timeline like when you think you're done or you're waiting for stuff to be done? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, like, so I had a deadline to turn it in, of course. And so that I remember asking my editor, do you want to read this like chapter by chapter? How do you want to do it? And she was very much, I'll read some chunks. Like she read a really big chunk to start, because I was like, oh, I want you to at least read a big chunk, because if it stinks, I need to know before I turn the whole thing in. So it was sort of like, here's like we really worked hard to get the forward in the first chapter and set that tone right. And then go forward and backwards. And a lot of it was like laying out chapters. Like there were a lot more chapters that were in there to begin with that we kind of condensed. Like it was kind of like, okay, how deep do we need to go? Mary, my editor, was the one that said, I don't think we want to tell a sad story here at the end. So she said, let's end it someplace good and then do the rest. Let's kind of smush the end and the reformation together. Because I originally had it all plotted through the collapse, the rebirth, and all of that. And she said, I think this is a nostalgia book. I think we need to have a happy story here, which was great advice. So there was a lot of give and take, a lot of back and forth. She's a great editor. I had Dick Girardi read the whole book, because Dick Girardi, who worked at the Philadelphia Daily News, is my mentor, and he knows the league as well as anybody. I needed him to kind of be like, sign off on, you got it right. Did I make any mistakes? Things like that. And then of course there's fact checkers at the publishers that they go through and check everything. So it's a process. It's a process. It was fun though, in a sick way.
When it comes out, what's that feeling like for you? I mean, again, newspapers before and stuff published online, but what's it like to be able to pick it up in your hands and know the box is coming?
It was pretty cool, because the step by step, like you're seeing like the galleys, right? You see them all laid out. Like, oh, that looks really cool. I like the font. And then you see like a picture of the cover. And the cover, I love the cover because they got the old Big East font to use on the cover page. Like it's the original font that the league used for its logo. And the picture of Patrick is just so emblematic of the league. So seeing the picture of like, oh, that looks really cool. I'm really excited. But when it comes in, you're like, I made a book. Like, that's really cool. Like, and then it's just, you're nervous, like, oh my God, I hope people aren't gonna be like, well, this is just all right. Like she missed, you know what I mean? Like, it didn't tell me anything. Like you're nervous about the reception of it because you put a lot into it. I mean, I'm still sitting here at my desk in my office with my files of, because I'm kind of like very organized. I have folders of every single interview I did labeled, like, from in alphabetical order, like Val Ackerman all the way to Lisa Zanecchia, the Big East editor, and I have their interviews printed out and shoved in the files, and I still haven't taken them down. Like, I don't know why, in case someone calls me and says the guy, that's wrong or something like that. Even though it's published, I'm just like, I'm going to hold on to those just a little bit longer in case I need to pull them out and someone says, wait, where did you get that? So like, yeah, it's been great. It's been fun.
So what's the reaction been? What have you heard?
Very positive. It's actually really nice. Just yesterday, I saw Dan Gavitt, Dave Gavitt's son, who works for the NCAA, and he hadn't read it yet, but he said, I've heard nothing but great things about it. I was like, okay, phew, Dan Gavitt likes it. I'm good to go. Jim Calhoun, I spoke to him last week because he retired, and I was having a conversation. He's like, hey, I've read the book. It was hilarious. He's like, I didn't realize that you were in our meetings. Like, it feels like you were there. I was like, okay, if Jim Calhoun likes it, I'm good. So I've gotten really positive feedback. I think people are getting, what I was trying to tell, what the purpose of the whole book was. So it feels good. Like, I'm glad that the casual fan loves it, of course, but to get sort of sign off from people that matter. Mike Tranghese read it. Mike was a big one. Like, I needed Mike to love it, and Mike absolutely loved it. So that made me feel really good too.
How did you get in those meetings? I mean, how do you pull that familiarity out of people to be able to share that back?
It's hard, it's basically like, tell me about some crazy things that happen in a meeting, and then someone tells a story, and then you have to go to the other person and get them to tell the story, and you almost kind of recreate the dialogue with separate interviews, right? Like, oh, I remember Rick Barnes told me a story about Louis Carnesecca dropping his hearing aids and crawling around the floor trying to find his hearing aids at the time that those were supposed to be casting a vote. So then I have to ask Louis if that actually happened. And I asked, Rick Pitino, do you remember that happening? That kind of a thing. Or Rick Pitino and Rolly Massimino practically came to blows over a ball deal, like arguing about how much money they should each get. Well, Rolly obviously isn't here to tell me anything, but certainly, again, like PJ Carlissimo was in that meeting, or Gary Williams was in that meeting, and Mitch Quanagaro, who was one of Rolly's assistants, could, oh yeah, I remember that phone call, and da 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 da. So it's like, you kind of have to back and forth. Every time I spoke to somebody, I kept saying, odds are I'm going to have to call you again. I'll try not to wear you out. So it was a lot of back and forth.
Do those, because you're covering basketball all the time now, does that level of personality, and I mean, you could have taken all those names you just dropped and made a mini Mount Rushmore of something for college basketball, right?
Yep.
Does that exist now, and we just don't get it as much? We don't see it because like the plethora of stuff, or was it again just the right time at the right, or were they that good?
I mean, I think, so certainly we have coaches of that caliber who are that mythology, that massive level, right? Mike Krzyzewski, Roy Williams. We have still that, Mount Rushmore of talented coaches. I don't think we have the personalities like we used to. I think coaches are terrified now between, in the current age, social media and being called to task for saying things out of turn or what have you. Money, of course, there's a lot more money to lose. I mean, if you look at some of the contracts these guys signed back in the day, it's laughable. I mean, it's like next to nothing how much money they were or weren't making. So there's a fear of being called on the carpet and losing a salary. I think people are just a little bit more wound tight about basketball than they are, like there's a lot more at stake. Like, coaches get fired a lot more quickly than they did back then. People stayed with coaches. I mean, they wanted to fire PJ Carlissimo for years, and they didn't. They stuck with PJ Carlissimo, and then he takes them to a Final Four. So, I don't know that runway exists for coaches anymore. And I think they feel that pressure anymore. And the last thing they want to do is put themselves in a position where they give someone cause to be angry at them. So I think we've lost some of that personality, frankly.
Happens during COVID, you're writing this, right? There was still a basketball season happening. There's still life happening. I'm always impressed when someone's able to balance all that stuff. Not surprised in your case, but impressed. What was your plan, and how did you activate it, accentuate it, make it work to make all that happen, right?
Yeah. So, basically I told my editor that I would do as many interviews as I could from January to March of 2020, thinking like I was going to be busy in March. And of course, thank COVID, I wasn't so busy in March of 2020. So good news, bad news was I gained some time back to do interviews. And I basically wrote most of it in the summer because things are quieter in the summer for me seasonally. So that was kind of my, okay, I'm going to grin and bear it and sit here at the beach and write as much as I can. You know, the challenge when you write for a living is the last thing you want to do when you get some time off is write. It's just like, ugh, sometimes, but it was so much fun. Like I told everybody that while we were in the middle of COVID and everyone was miserable, I'm like getting people in the 80s to tell me hilarious stories. So the interviews were so much fun. Organizing them, like I said, was really, really hard. But, you know, yeah, like, you know, basketball happens, the real job happens. You just, what do you do? I mean, I'm fortunate my kids are older, so they're not like, you know, worried that I'm ignoring them. So, you know, they understood what I was doing. But it was tricky. I ended up making this crazy outline. I kind of forgot about it, where I took every interview, like I told you, I have all those folders of interviews, and I would read them. And I made an outline I wrote it, like I typed it, chapter 1. And I would just put like, you know, Ackerman page 2 of her interview, and put a kind of a note to what that quote is. So I realized like what quotes fit in what chapter, which made it a lot easier to write too. So that took a long time to go through all of my interviews and kind of parse the stories out where they fit. So there was like, I don't mind writing. I still like to write. I still enjoy the act of writing. So that part's never that hard for me. It's more preparing to write. That was hard.
When you got on a run, I mean, did you schedule times when you were going to write, or did you just sit down and write? And if you were on a roll, you kept going? How did you do that?
Basically I would kind of, you know, do as much as I could on a morning. I like to work in the mornings just a lot, generally speaking. I did as much as I could in the morning and kind of plotted along. When I wrote the book on Villanova a few years ago, Jerry Brewer, who works at the Washington Post, gave me great advice. I thought, he said, if you finish a chapter, start the next one, even if it's like 200 words. He said, because it's going to flow from one to the next. He said, so that will make you pick up more easily than having to go back and say, what did I just finish writing? Now you're kind of you're started on the next one. That was such great advice. So like I think you put the chapter on the first chapter and how they formed, and you can go into the next chapter. It's just like, oh, okay, now I'm on a rhythm when I go back to it. Because sometimes the hardest thing is like, what was I saying? So yeah, that was the greatest advice I got, honestly.
Is it too early to ask what the next book is?
Yes. No, I don't have one in my mind. I mean, I thought about a couple ones. I did a story this summer on the old 5-star basketball camp, you know, and that was crazy too, like equally crazy with some of the stories. And, you know, you got Patrick Ewing serving food as a cafeteria worker because that's how he paid his way to go to 5-star. Like what? Like, wait, what? Like Patrick Ewing and Michael Jordan are your cafeteria workers. Okay. So I thought about that. I don't know if it's just too small. I mean, I'd like to do another one. I need to breathe a little bit. It was fun. Like I said, it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So I'd like to do another one. And I think, you know, now that I feel like I have an editor, you know, within the publishing company there and an agent, like I have people that like know that I'm capable. So that helps too.
But you're not going to not work, right? I mean, you're doing The Athletic. It's not like it's just additional work that you're not going to do it for a little while.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, I'm still busy with the real world. Certainly that's the other thing, back to the real job. I mean, The Athletic was so kind and, you know, I mean, not that I took that much time off, but basically my editor was like, hey, you have like 5 weeks of vacation. I would suggest you take it this summer and go write a book. I was like, that's a great idea. And I did. So he was very helpful.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Love talking to you always. And congratulations on the book, which doesn't look at the background, but there it is. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Penn State COMMversations. For more information about the Donald P. Bellisario College of Communications, including the latest news and upcoming events, visit bellisario.psu.edu or find us on social media at PSU Bellisario on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.